Excuse me, sir.
Yes, sir.
We realize that you have a choice amongst scale notes, and we appreciate you flying with the You'll Hear It podcast.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Adam Maness.
And I'm Peter Martin.
And you are still listening to the You'll Hear It podcast.
Oh, daily jazz advice coming at you. What do you mean still?
Well, we have a lot of return listeners. We have a lot of new folks, but I just want to say a quick thanks to everybody who listens in and
that's right,
and sends us emails and sends us messages. We love you all, and we couldn't do this without you.
You know what? And I want to just say thanks to even all the people that haven't rated or reviewed or sent anything in. That's all good too.
Even those folks?
Yeah, man. You know what it is? They're taking a little time, little 10 to 12 minutes out of their day to be with us, and that's beautiful.
So today we're talking about scale note choices. We have a speak pipe, a voice message from Mirko. He's Italian. Let's hear it.
Hi guys, I'm Mirko from Italy. First of all, thank you for what you're doing. I love the podcast, and I lost count of how many stars I should give you, but let's say 7 because it sounds good. I was wondering if you could make an episode about the scale modes and their applications. Like, do you think of them about I want this kind of vibe, so I'm gonna use this mode, or do you let the chord changes guide you to which mode you have to use? Or I don't know, if you could just talk a bit about it. Thanks.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think, so I think there's two parts that he's saying. You know, do we use the chord changes to guide to which scale to choose and then to make choices within that scale, I think, is part of it.
Yep.
Or do we go straight to what the scale is? And I would say both at different times, you know, depending upon the situation. I think that when you're learning and depending on like where you are in your development, it's very important to kind of break it down by chord. Mm-hmm. And then later on, it gets a little more advanced when you're looking at maybe whole progressions and possibly even taking one scale or a couple scales and floating them above that,
yep.
Which is a great thing. But we're working all that in together, and for, you know, a lot of times it comes down to a stylistic thing and whether, you know, how quickly the chord changes are moving. I mean, if you're going like 1 2 1 2 3 4 doom ding doom ding doom ding, and each one of those is 2 beats for a different chord.
I'm just all diatonic, baby.
Yeah, man. You're not thinking about, I mean, you shouldn't be, because if you're thinking about a different scale for each one of those, even if you can keep up with that, you're not going to be making choices.
No.
They're going to be making choices on you.
They're going to
be
making choices on you, yeah.
But you know, having said, I don't know, is that kind of the way you see it?
No,
or?
This is a process. I think that's the important part. And if you don't know what scales go over what chords or what your options are for scales over what chords, you have to learn that first as much as possible so that you have the language, you know, because at a certain point, once you sort of get to a higher level, you're not thinking about that at all.
Right.
You're literally just thinking about the sound, the shape, the themes that you're working with. And you have all these options available to you for each chord. And you're not really even thinking about the chord because you know that sound, that shape. You're literally just dealing with sounds at a certain point.
Right.
But you can't get those sounds unless you really do the work, practice running the scales over the chords,
right.
and understanding the differences between them, you know?
Yeah. And I think that certain scales, there's the harmonic component to them, you know, that harmonic vibe that they reflect when you play them in certain ways that is so important. Mm-hmm. You know, we always talk about not just running up and down scales, and we don't. Yeah. But it doesn't mean we don't sometimes. I mean, I know that I will say over like a 5 chord that's extended maybe for a couple measures, that's like a big alteration, and say I'm using the altered scale over that. I may only play over that and do kind of scale fragments, maybe some shapes and things or whatever, but it almost becomes the choices of how to do that become based upon how I want that tension to come out, which is really a harmonic thing, but I'm using, you know, melodic improvisation, you know, within that framework. So yeah, I'm not necessarily thinking C altered scale, but I am thinking of zones and shapes and things that fit into that. And that's a powerful thing. I almost think sometimes, especially in more traditional styles, and I don't mean like totally like beginnings of jazz ragtime traditional, I just mean more like, say you're playing a solo piano ballad of a standard, that when you get to certain chords, you almost have to do certain scales. Not necessarily one scale. You have choices, and I know we're talking about scale, note choices within scales, so you have several scales sometimes. But sometimes, depending on what you played before, you only have one really choice of scale.
You set yourself up.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're a genius. I mean, if you're like Herbie Hancock and you can come up with some other scale for another like non-chord zone.
Inventing scales on the fly.
Yeah. And I mean, we all do that and try to do that, of course. But I mean, how it sounds is important. And normally that's going to bring more tension in. And if you're doing that at the right time, then that becomes a good choice. But you're still within a scale area, and then you're making choices based on, I think, more melodic concepts as opposed to just technical scale.
Yeah, I guess the answer to Mirkos's question is yes. Like, you are making choices about the modes, but you're not thinking about it like that, is what we're saying. You know, you're thinking about it in terms of a broader concept.
Yeah.
Now, when you practice this and you're a beginner, you're an intermediate player, you need to practice this thinking about the modes over the chords.
Right.
No one gets out of here without knowing a little bit of what notes sound good over what chords. That's what we do. You know?
And that becomes a big part of the note choice, I think.
Right.
So you know you have the choices of the whole scale.
But not all those are the right choice.
Not all those, and not at that time.
At that time.
I mean, any one of them at some time. I mean, there's no like bad note for any situation.
Right.
But
that's how did Miles Davis always pick the most magical note for every situation? You know what I mean? Like,
he understood that. And look, the bottom line is, especially when you get into so-called modal playing and when there's a lot of space involved, you know, you're basically looking at the advanced level at the chromatic scale as being your choice at all times.
Because you can figure out how to make that work.
Yeah.
You know, and
yeah, but you can't also just always play like that, or it's going to sound like you don't know how to play over changes, you know.
Right.
And I think that those choices, you know, to your point about when you're practicing, that you're being a lot more conscious, and that's our opportunity to learn about which notes sound good in different situations within the scale. So yeah, you're running up and down the scale, but you're also practicing them in thirds, broken fifths. So you're starting to set up patterns of usage of these scales, but actual real life situations. So not all that's going to sound good,
right?
But that's okay. You're kind of cataloging that, and that's as much as the technical thing as getting it in your ears, kind of what works. So when you get that situation, you'll be like, bam, I know how to make the right choice.
And it is situational. You know, you could play a diminished scale over a major chord if you wanted to.
Yep.
But you shouldn't probably do that on the very first measure of your solo. That's a tension building or tension releasing point of your solo. That can happen.
Yeah.
Anything can happen.
It's your solo. You can't say it's a wrong choice, but it might not be a wise choice.
I might not want to hear it.
Yeah.
But no, there's, you know, you like you said with the chromatic scale, you have all these choices really at a certain point available to you, but the master knows how to put them in to be the most emotionally effective,
right? To
be the most musical in terms of really getting the what you're trying to convey to your audience out at the right time.
Yep. Yeah. And then, you know, I think it's too is important to think about, don't ever think about scales when you have different choices of scales to use over a particular chord. Let's say, you know, a major, just a C major, you know, obviously you have the major scale, and then you have the leading scales, probably sort of the next level that you would go one note different, just that sharp fourth. So, you know, you learn both of those, but learn how that changes from major to leading, because a lot of times we like to use those in setting up our melodic, you know, improvisation going back and forth.
Yep.
So you want to learn the difference, and to do it in a progression is good, because then you're only changing one note at a time. You can't necessarily go from C major to diminished. I mean, you can, but that's a lot more advanced to be able to hear what that difference. You need to eventually hear that too, but start with the, you know, dominant scale to a major scale. There's one note different. Like, how does that sound different? How can you play around with that different? Because after you get pretty good at, say, your choices over just a C major scale, you kind of like, I kind of like some more choices. So as much as you can talk about passing tones and minor third or dominant seventh or whatever, it does become a thing of shifting to other scales and then shifting back.
That's right. Yeah. And also, what in that similar vein, what matters is context too. Yeah. You know, a lot of these things you can't just drop in on their own. You have to set them up, as we were talking about, or they're setting something else up.
Yep.
And that's when you really start thinking about colors and shapes and sounds, as opposed to just like plug in, you know, Dorian scale here, you know.
Okay, if you're not on YouTube, you can't see Adam's using his robot hands.
So let's talk about some actual ways that you can maybe work on this, on getting these modes into your head and getting these modes into your fingers. One thing that I always go back to, and I actually read this really cool post by Ethan Iverson, friend of the show, who was talking about, you know, tunes that with like a lot of changes that that go all over the place are
Yep.
actually easier than, say, like a rhythm changes,
Right.
which stays a little more diatonic,
Yep.
and things happen kind of fast,
Yep.
and there's not as much contrast between the changes.
I got to read that article.
It's
I totally agree with it.
It's very. I agree. It was like, oh yeah, that's totally.
Yeah, it makes
so,
sense.
So I always kind of go back to rhythm changes in my practice if I want to practice running modes or whatever, because we
Yep.
do have these options over the major chords, over the dominant chords. You have all those secondary dominants in the bridge.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there's a ton of choices.
Yep.
And I would say practice rhythm changes slowly. Start in B flat, but go to all 12 keys and really try to vary the modes. Figure out what modes sound good next to each other. Figure out what scales you don't know, and
Yep.
then work on those.
That's
in those
important.
in those keys.
Because when you get in the moment, the ones you don't know, you're just not going to play.
yeah, if you can't play an
That's not a choice.
an F sharp dominant scale, reliably, you gotta. Can Peter do it? Okay, Peter Martin can do that, obviously.
Bam.
But if you can't, that's now and
Yep.
that's something to work on for the
Exactly.
next few weeks. So.
And that's when you get into that really good, meat and potatoes kind of, or tofu and collard greens, kind of area of like concrete things to practice. Everyone's always asking us like, what should I practice? I feel lost in these different things. It's like keep a catalog of just those basics,
Yep.
and then when you're feeling a little lost or don't know, go you've got some concrete things you can knock out.
Totally, that's totally true. But my advice is start with rhythm changes for running scales. If you try rhythm changes in A flat, you're going to be wide open.
Hello.
Of like, oh, there's a lot I can't do. You know what I mean?
Right.
I remember the first time I tried that, it was tough. So, yeah. Got anything else for that?
No, I was just gonna say thank you for the question, and everybody can go to you'llhearit.com.
Definitely.
And you can leave a question, you can leave a comment.
What if they wanted to express their love of You'll Hear It in a physical way on their person at some point?
That'd be a tattoo. And we don't.
We offer You'll Hear It tattoos?
No,
now?
we don't. You're on your own, and we need approval of our logo. Copyright 2018.
Like the New
what are you
York
talking about? A
Times.
physical? Oh, a T-shirt.
A T-shirt, man.
That's
I was
right.
just
And
trying
I
to set you
finally
up.
have one. Did I tell you?
You got a You'll Hear It T-shirt.
I got two.
Ooh, did
Somebody
you get the cassette?
gifted me. I did not get the cassette. I got the because I'm still not convinced that's a thing, but we'll see. No, I got the traditional
You'll Hear
logo,
It.
and I got a long sleeve because we're coming up to fall.
I got to get a long sleeve.
Yeah.
Maybe if someone wants to give me an extra large
Maybe so.
long sleeve, I would be.
Yeah. Although I'm actually this evening I'm going to the southern hemisphere, and I was thinking, I'm going to bring but maybe it's not winter there anymore. It must be. It's kind of spring.
It's spring, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to Brazil,
Ooh.
so I don't need my.
It's spring in Brazil,
Wow. Oh, that's right. No. They do that the same time we do. Yeah. Carnival is. Yeah. In the spring. Here.
But what they're not drumming even in the
Oh no, they're getting ready. They're getting ready. Believe me, they're just not going buck wild yet.
I got it.
Cool. Well, until tomorrow.
You'll hear it.